12. At Heathrow, Ace hung back while the doctor bartered for a taxi outside the arrivals building. The doctor had a knack with taxis. Within 5 minutes they were riding out of the airport on the back of the motorcycles, driving down a long concrete tunnel and angling low to the ground as they swept onto the curving orbital roads. Armoured cars lined the escape lanes, and khaki uniformed squaddies stood smoking and talking on the grassed verges beside them. As soon as the taxi bikes were past the airport perimeter, they hit the traffic. A solid column of locked metal, cars extending back along the approaching roads as far as you could see. Some of the lines of traffic were moving, most weren't. Gypsy-looking roadsiders moved up and down the stalled columns selling food, newspapers themselves. Ragged children tagged along with some of the roadsiders, a whole subculture that had grown with the traffic problem, their numbers rising in symmetry with the falling average speed of cars in urban centres. Ace had her arms wrapped around her taxi driver, a Sikh in red and white leather jacket with heavy shoulder pads. In front of her, she could see the doctor sitting on the back of the other motorcycle. For some reason, his hat hadn't blown off. The bikes reduced speed as they entered the traffic pattern, slowing, dodging, threading through the motionless lines of vehicles. The fumes were thick around them now. They accelerated again, hitting a stretch where there was clearance for the bikes. Ace's driver offered her a mask, holding it over his shoulder, dangling by its strap. Ace shouted that she was all right. They'd be out of the worst of it soon, and she liked to feel the slipstream on her face. The cars on either side of them blurred as the speed of the motorcycle picked up. Ace looked at the endless stalled traffic. Passenger vehicles, giant container trucks, even some of the old-fashioned taxis. The ones that were black cars. Ace could remember when London had been full of them. Some of the drivers in the passenger cars were using phones or watching television. Some had computers on, doing work ready for when they eventually reached their offices. But most just sat passively, their engines churning exhaust and their air conditioning carrying the fumes back into them. Ace could hear a sound, swept back to her by the wind over the driver's shoulder. The Sikh was laughing. He made a rude gesture at these sheep sitting in their cars, twisted his throttle, and they roared away. The taxis carried them down the old M2, bouncing over the ruts in the broken road surface. The air was clean, and Ace was enjoying the cold sting of it on her face when the doctor signalled, waving his arm in a slowing down signal to Ace's driver. Ace found herself looking for a place where it would make sense to stop. They'd travelled for about 90 kilometres down the old ruined motorway, heading due south. They were in the heart of Kent now, the green hills and afternoon sun a little unreal to Ace. She still felt vaguely disorientated by fragmented sleep and airline champagne. She saw the doctor tap his driver on the shoulder, and the driver hand signalled. They slowed and pulled over to an escape lane on the left, and Ace's driver followed. Up off the weed-grown band of the motorway and along a slip road. Ahead of her, Ace saw the red and yellow symbol of McDonald's. The two bikes coasted into the parking lot and switched off. The restaurant had been built as part of a complex intended to serve the motorway. It was adjacent to a service station and a modular hotel. These were all abandoned now. Ace was looking at the fuel pumps outside the service station, automatically wondering if there was any petrol left in the underground tanks and how difficult it would be to ignite. Perhaps someone had already made use of it. The side wall of the McDonald's had the distinctive scorch patterns Ace associated with Molotov cocktails. The restaurant had been closed down even before the motorway had died, the traffic siphoning off into the new route south. Ace remembered the headlines in the tabloids about it at the time. An attack by witch kids throwing petrol bombs. The tabloids were still big on the witch kids, and this had been their biggest atrocity to date. Details had been suppressed under the Official Secrets Act, but whatever had happened, it was evidently enough of a disincentive to make McDonald's abandon the franchise. Now, the place looked strange, its brightly coloured plastic trim holding up well against the weather, but most of the glass smashed and the interior of the restaurant burned out and gutted. The wall surfaces had been covered with spray-painted hex signs. The doctor was paying the taxi drivers. Both of the men were Sikhs, their helmets especially adapted to accommodate their turbans, official Hackney carriage licences clamped to their handlebars. They stood beside their motorcycles, stretching their legs while the doctor searched through a large, old-fashioned wallet. Ace crossed the parking lot, feeling pins and needles in her thighs, circulation returning after the long bike ride. She looked at the bombed-out building and felt an impulse to go into the darkness and explore. There were dead leaves piled against the doors by the wind. She put her hand to the cool glass of the undamaged door. There was a decal above the handle which read, "Push." "Watch out for glass," called the doctor, without looking around. Inside, there were ragged patches of sunlight on the floor, coming in through the holes in the ceiling. Dirty puddles of rainwater had collected in the seats of the plastic chairs attached to the small tables. From one corner of the roof came the crying of a small bird she couldn't identify. A brittle food carton split and shattered under Ace's foot. In the kitchen area beyond the service counter, she could hear something dripping steadily and endlessly. Bright laminated mini posters on the tabletops still offered turkey McGuffins and veal nuggets. One wall was dominated by a mural of Ronald McDonald in the rainforest helping the Indians. The dripping was louder towards the back of the restaurant. This was the area where the kitchen staff worked, unwrapping and heating instant meals. There were wide black fan-shaped burns on all the surfaces around the cooking units. The grills were thick with old congealed grease. The glass door of every microwave oven was smeared, as if something had burst during heating. Someone had cooked a final chaotic meal here, before they blew out the windows and set the place on fire. Ace stumbled over an object behind the counter, a child's high chair. She set it upright, the brightly coloured plastic toys rattling as they settled into place on their wire. In an open space on the floor, there was evidence of other fires. Crude campfires built directly on the tiles. Ace was beginning to realise that the place had had visitors since the night it was destroyed. Perhaps on a regular basis, perhaps quite recently. The wind howled around the roof and the rhythm of the dripping changed. All the spots of sunlight on the floor vanished at once as a cloud mass drifted over the Kentish hills, cancelling the sunlight above the restaurant. Inside, Ace was peering at the hex marks on the walls. These consisted of various occult symbols, each particular gang having its own set. It was the fashion to use them to mark the site of a successful attack. Ace studied them, feeling old and a little sad. When she had been a kid, she could recognise almost every spray-painted tag on every graffiti-scrawled wall in her neighbourhood. Ace identified the sadness. She felt left out. These symbols meant nothing to her. She noticed that one was smaller than the others and more sloppily executed. Leaning close, she could see that it had been daubed in something other than spray paint, dark and dull. Ace was aware of the silence now. The wind had fallen, the bird had stopped crying, the dripping had ceased. She stirred the remains of a fire with the toe of her Doc Martens shoe. The fires on the floor actually weren't so crude. Someone had known what they were doing. This one was a well-built pyramid, wooden brands leaning in against each other, coals or small wood chips and twists of newspaper underneath to get it started. The burned wood had collapsed inwards, and one blackened piece protruded from the pile, a segment of branch about the length of her forearm. As Ace nudged the dead fire, the piece slid out, striking the toe of her shoe. She expected it to collapse to ash, but the brand rolled out of the fire and hit the floor with a hard, brittle rattle. It looked like wood, but it didn't sound like it. And Ace had misjudged the length of the piece. It was more the size of the long bone in her leg. Now she looked at the remains of the fire more closely. There was something in the centre of it, half buried in the ash, the burned wood covering it, about the size of a football. The sound came abruptly from behind her, rattling off the metal edges of the cooker, a staccato spattering sound like a machine gun. Ace jerked away from the fire, getting ready to run, remembering the tent on the island, even as she realised it was just the sound of motorcycles. The taxis leaving. She turned to look across the counter out towards the parking lot. Standing there on the other side of the counter, just a metre away from her, was the doctor. The sound of the bikes echoed on the concrete of the car park and faded away. North, back towards London. Ace stood by the broken cash register, facing the doctor. "Do you want fries with that?" she said. "What does this place remind you of, Ace?" She looked around. Sunlight was coming through the holes in the roof again. The small pools of rainwater in the rows of chairs were glowing cheerfully, still and golden. A paper cup rolled in the draught, ricocheting off the legs of the tables and ending up spinning under a large hex sign by the entrance. She noticed that on the big mural at the back of the restaurant, someone had added a rainforest arrow, going through Ronald's head. "McDonald's," said Ace. "It reminds me of a deconsecrated church." The doctor walked away to stand in the centre of the restaurant. Ace slid across the counter and followed him. "Perhaps one that has been put to a new purpose. That would be the altar over there." The doctor pointed to the scorched kitchen section with its dead campfires. "Those are the new decorations." He indicated the hex signs. "Spray paint instead of stained glass or carved stone." "Some of it's not spray paint," said Ace. "These are the benches for the congregation." The doctor scrambled across a plastic tabletop. Now he was standing in the middle of a space on the restaurant floor where several tables had been torn free and removed. "And this would be the dance floor?" The doctor looked at Ace as if he had just remembered she was there. "Why not?" he said, and smiled. "Because you don't have dance floors in churches," said Ace. "Depends on the religion," said the doctor. "What do you know about witches, Ace?" "Witch kids, you mean? Or real witches?" "What's a real witch?" The wind had risen outside and blew straight through the open space where the big front window used to be. It chilled Ace. 1 week in the sun and she'd forgotten about the English wind. "I just meant proper witches instead of the kids. You know, the goths, the witch kids, the crows." "What do you know about the crows?" "They did this place over. Some people got killed." The wind was whistling through the roof again. The paper cup scuttled across the floor. Ace knew what it was, but it still made her flinch. She picked it up and moved to one of the tan litter bins in an alcove. There was a sticker on the swinging lid with a picture of the planet printed in green ink. "We care," said the lettering on the sticker. "Some people never pick up after themselves." The doctor took the paper cup from her before she could push it into the bin. "Some people never get a chance," he said. "Someone was drinking from this. Perhaps they were interrupted." He showed her the cup. Empty inside. Clean. But there was a lipstick print on the rim. For the first time, Ace let herself think about the night it had all happened and what it might have been like in this place. Cars in the parking lot, families inside in the light and warmth, looking out through the windows at the darkness. And then darkness coming in, smashing in through the window, claiming them. She shivered in the rising wind. "I'm not afraid of them," said Ace. The doctor smiled. "Let's go, shall we?" They pushed through the glass doors and out into the big empty parking lot. Ace looked back over her shoulder into the gutted interior of the restaurant. "Have a nice day," she said. Behind the restaurant complex there were giant waste modules with attachments designed to link with the big lifting trucks. The modules had stood here, unemptied and untouched, since the place had been attacked. There was a heavy smell of old rot around them. Beyond the painted squares of the staff car park, there was a wire fence with a high, jagged hole cut in it, big enough for a person to walk through. Ace wondered if this was the way the crows had come in. The doctor held the flap of wire for her as she stepped through. She climbed with him up a shoulder of green hillside that rose up behind the complex. The first few metres was lawn that had gone wild, growing long and invaded by weeds. But further up the slope, this gave way to thick bushes, nettles and brambles. Ace couldn't say at exactly what point it happened, but somewhere they crossed an invisible border and they were standing in the countryside. She looked back at the restaurant complex. From the brow of the hill, the buildings were orderly, geometric shapes, nothing remotely strange about them. Perhaps they were still to be completed, waiting for the grand opening. But nothing bad could ever have happened there. Tell me what else you know about the crows. You know what they've done, and you know you're not afraid of them. What else? Ace looked at the doctor. She liked walking with him. She liked having a chance to talk. At school, when I was a kid, we were all wearing chippies and shaving brand names into our hair. Some of the kids even had them tattooed. You know, like designer names on their faces. The crows like their tattoos too. But this is different, isn't it? Yes, said the doctor. They climbed over a low barbed wire fence and entered a field, moving diagonally across it. The grass stung Ace's bare ankles. She was working up a sweat as they walked. In the sky above them a jet fighter climbed, too far away to hear. It left twin white streaks of vapour trail behind it. Further back, the neat parallel track was beginning to fragment and blur. It looked like a broken twist of DNA in the sky. They surprised some birds arguing in a thick hedgerow. The birds fell silent as they passed. Ace couldn't see them among the dense twigs and the dusty green leaves. Bright red berries gleamed. Are those berries poisonous? They are now, said the doctor. He opened his umbrella. Ace joined him, walking close beside him under the shelter of the umbrella as it began to rain. Ace checked her watch. It was right on time. The evening rain, carrying industrial poisons from Germany. It made a steady, gentle drumming on the fabric over them. I missed the crows. I mean, I wasn't around when it got started. I was too old. When I first saw them, I thought they were goths. But they were too political. And then I thought they were hippies. But they were too violent. Ace looked back down again towards the roadside buildings below them. A cluster of trees blocked her view. If she hadn't walked that way, she would never know they were there. It used to be blues parties or acid raves, or motorbikes in a fight on Saturday night. Ace remembered the sound of bottles breaking after the pubs shut. Some of her own Saturday nights when she was still a kid. A boy lying bleeding and crying on top of a spilled carton of Chinese food. The way everybody ran because they thought the police were coming. Ace had put a handkerchief to his face. It had been a nasty cut, but shallow. She got grease and plum sauce all over her good jeans, her Saturday night outfit. She wondered why she bothered. No blood, though, and the police never did come. They came out of the field and through a gap in the hedge, the countryside around them looking suddenly sad in the rain. The sky was an odd yellow. On the other side of the hedge was a narrow country lane, trees close on either side, forming a canopy above them. The doctor closed the umbrella again. Almost there, he said. Almost where? Said Ace. But then they walked around a curve and she could see for herself. At a wide point in the lane, a small car was parked, nosed into a tangled hedge. An Austin A35, 50 years old, but gleaming as if it was new. Ace didn't know which was more unlikely, finding a car there or finding one in such good nick. The doctor was taking something out of his pocket. Keys. He turned to her and smiled. You drive. They drove through small villages with cherry trees edging the road. The pale pink bloom was thick in the October heat. Clouds of shed blossom drifted in front of the car like snow until the heavy rain arrived and soaked it down.